The emergency klaxon shattered the peaceful quiet of the Council rescue ship Peacekeeper like a sledgehammer through glass. Lieutenant Commander Velthera's blue-scaled fingers froze over her console as the subspace beacon tore through there. Communications array with the fury of a dying star. You know that feeling when your phone buzzes at 3 a.m.? That instant dread that something terrible has happened. Multiply that by 1,000. And you might understand what Velthara felt as the translation matrix struggled to decode the primitive signal flooding her screens. "By the void, ... double quotes," she whispered, her voice lost in the ship's mechanical heartbeat. The words scrolling across her display made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. This wasn't just any distress call. This was a message from hell itself. The signal originated from Sector 9 Delta, the Forbidden Zone. The quarantined region of space that every civilized species avoided like a plague ship, because that's where they lived. The monsters. The nightmares that had once brought the galaxy to its knees. The Deathworlders. Captain Mordok. Velthera's voice cracked like thin ice under pressure, carrying a terror that made every crew member on the bridge freeze. "It's from a human colony ship, the Freedom's Dawn. They're broadcasting from the quarantine zone, and they're dying." Captain Mordok's reptilian head snapped up from his command chair, all four of his golden eyes widening in shock. His scaled hands gripped the armrests so tightly that the metal groaned under the pressure. In 40 years of service to the Galactic Council, he had never received a distress call from human space, and there was a good reason for that. Every child in the galaxy grew up hearing the stories whispered in dark corners and told around flickering campfires. Stories of the species that had crawled out of a world so violent, so brutal, so utterly hostile to life that it had forged them into living weapons. A planet where the very air was poison, where massive predators hunted in packs, where natural disasters could level entire continents without warning. Earth, the death world. The humans who survived there didn't just endure, they thrived. They turned their world's deadliest creatures into companions, calling massive predators pets and best friends. They took the plants that could kill with a touch and turned them into medicine. They looked at disasters that would annihilate other species and called them weather. But here's where it gets really terrifying. They didn't stop there. When humanity finally reached the stars, they brought that death world mentality with them. They built ships that could ram through asteroid fields without taking damage. They created weapons that made entire fleets surrender rather than face them in battle. They fought 3 separate galactic empires simultaneously and nearly won. The only thing that stopped them? They chose to stop. One day they simply withdrew to their quarantine zone and disappeared, leaving behind only whispered legends and nightmares. Until now. The static-filled transmission crackled across the bridge. Speakers, and through the electronic chaos, a voice emerged that changed everything. It was young, frightened, but determined, the voice of a child trying to be brave in the face of death. Double quotes, please. "Anyone out there? ... We need help. Our reactor is failing, and people are dying. The life support systems are shutting down one by one. This is Lily Martinez aboard the colony ship Freedom's Dawn. We have 15,000 civilians on board, including 5,000 children. Please, if anyone can hear this, help us." The bridge of the Peacekeeper fell into absolute silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a well-run ship, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. Every crew member stood frozen, caught between their deepest fears and their most basic moral instincts. Captain Mordok felt something crack inside his chest, not fear, but something deeper. Something that transcended species, politics, and even survival instinct. Here was a child, alone and terrified, crying out into the vast emptiness of space for someone, anyone, to care enough to help. What would you do? Would you risk everything, your ship, your crew, your life, to answer that call? Would you sail into the most dangerous region of known space to save strangers who might be more dangerous than any enemy you'd ever faced? But then again, what kind of person turns their back on a dying child? The transmission continued, growing weaker with each passing second as the colony ship's power systems failed. Through the static, they could hear background sounds that painted a picture of absolute desperation alarms, blaring, people shouting instructions, the distant sound of what might have been crying. Our main reactor is at 12% and falling. Lily's voice continued, maintaining that heartbreaking composure that only children can manage in crisis. We've lost artificial gravity on decks 7 through 15. The medical bay is overwhelmed, and we're running out of time. Belthara's hands shook as she ran a quick analysis of the signal. "Captain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Based on the signal degradation and power fluctuations, they have maybe 6 hours before total systems failure. After that, ... She didn't need to finish. Everyone on the bridge knew what after that meant. 15,000 people, men, women, children floating dead in the cold vacuum of space aboard a tomb ship. Captain Mordock stood slowly, his decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter morning. He looked around at his crew representatives. Of a dozen different species, all united under the Galactic Council's banner of peace and cooperation, they were explorers, scientists, diplomats. They weren't warriors or heroes, but sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. "Helm," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command and the tremor of fear. "Set course for Sector 9 Delta. Maximum burn." The helmsman's tentacles froze over his controls. "Sir, that's the quarantine zone." "Council regulations explicitly forbid a child is dying." Captain Mordock cut him off. "Council regulations can go to hell." While the Council rescue ship Peacekeeper raced through hyperspace towards certain doom, something far more dangerous was already in motion. Something that would make the galaxy tremble and enemy fleets flee in terror before a single shot was fired at. Year-old Lily Martinez wasn't just any frightened child crying for help in the darkness of space. She was the niece of General Marcus Thompson, one of Earth's most decorated military commanders, and he had taught her things that would make seasoned warriors proud. Things like courage, determination, and most importantly, how to call for the kind of help that turns nightmares into reality for anyone foolish enough to threaten human civilians. You see, while Lily broadcast her desperate plea on the standard emergency frequencies that any passing ship might hear, her small hands were working with deadly precision on a second, far more dangerous task. Hidden beneath the colony ship's main communications panel, behind layers of scorched metal and failing circuits, was a device that looked innocuous enough, a small black box, no bigger than a smartphone. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. That innocent-looking device was a black channel emergency transponder, hardwired directly into the most secure military communication networks in human space. It was designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to send a signal that would reach every human military vessel within 100 light years and deliver a message that carried the weight of an absolute death sentence with the same steady hands that had just begged the galaxy for mercy. Lily activated the transponder and transmitted 4 simple words that would change everything. Human civilians under attack. Now here's where things get interesting. The galaxy had spent decades telling itself comfortable lies about humanity's withdrawal from galactic politics. They convinced themselves that humans had grown soft, become peaceful, maybe even lost their edge during their self-imposed isolation. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. In the cold depths of space, across dozens of star systems, dormant military networks suddenly exploded into activity. Ships that had been running dark invisible to sensors, hidden from prying eyes, received the black channel transmission and began transformation. Sequences that would have terrified anyone watching. The heavy cruiser Retribution's Edge was conducting deep patrol operations along the rim when her captain received the signal. Within seconds, every system aboard the ship switched from stealth mode to full combat readiness. Weapon systems that had been powered down roared to life. Engines that had been running silent screamed to maximum burn. And a crew that had been quietly monitoring empty space suddenly became a pack of wolves scenting blood. The destroyer *blood and Thunder *, was in the middle of classified reconnaissance when the transponder's cry pierced through subspace. Her commander didn't hesitate. He abandoned the mission instantly and set course for Sector 9 Delta at maximum velocity, pushing his engines past their safety limits because when human children are in danger, engineering specifications become mere suggestions. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the response from the super dreadnought Unbreakable, flagship of Strike Group Alpha and one of the most feared warships in human space. Admiral Rebecca Hayes was reviewing training reports when the Black Channel signal reached her bridge. And what happened next would become legend in military academies across the galaxy. Admiral Hayes didn't shout. She didn't panic. She simply stood up from her command chair, and when she spoke, her voice cut through subspace communications like molten steel through tissue paper. This is Strike Group Alpha. We have Terran civilians in distress. All vessels, maximum burn to coordinates immediately. Authorization code, Omega Red. Now, if you're not familiar with military terminology, let me explain what authorization Omega Red means. It's the code that removes every safety protocol, every speed limitation, every concern for equipment preservation or crew comfort. It means that the situation is so critical that admirals are willing to burn out their engines, risk their ships, and potentially sacrifice everything to reach the target coordinates as fast as physically possible. It's the code that says, our children are dying and hell itself won't stop us from reaching them. What happened next was beautiful and terrible to behold. Across human space, every available warship began converging on Sector 9 Delta, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Ships abandoned their missions, broke off from training exercises, and emerged from deep space assignments with one unified purpose: protect the children. The light cruiser Terra's Wrath was conducting anti-piracy operations. 3 systems away when she received a signal, her engine screamed as she jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind a half-completed mission and a very confused pirate fleet that suddenly found themselves alone and wondering why they felt like they had just dodged a bullet. The heavy destroyer, Iron Vengeance, was in dry dock for maintenance when the transponder's cry reached Earth's orbital shipyards. Within minutes, her skeleton crew had powered up her reactors and launched her with half her repairs incomplete. Because when human civilians are in danger, maintenance schedules become irrelevant. But here's what made this response truly terrifying. It wasn't just the military ships that answered the call. Across human space, civilian vessels carrying former military personnel received the Black Channel transmission and began making their own preparations. Merchant captains who had served in the colonial wars started plotting courses to Sector 9 Delta. Retired Marines cleaning their weapons and checking their armor. Former pilots warming up civilian craft that suddenly seemed to sprout hidden weapon systems, you see. There's something the galaxy never understood about humanity's military structure. It's not just the active ships and serving personnel that make up Earth's defense forces. It's every human who has ever worn the uniform. Every civilian who remembers what it means to stand between the darkness and the innocent. Every person who understands that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds. And right now, all of them were converging on one point in space where a little girl named Lily Martinez was fighting to keep 15,000 people alive long enough for help to arrive. The galaxy was about to be reminded of a fundamental, tried very hard to forget. Humanity doesn't just fight wars, they win them. The Peacekeeper dropped out of hyperspace into what looked like a graveyard of dreams and shattered hopes. Captain Mordoc's 4 eyes took in the scene before him, and even his battle-hardened warrior's heart clenched at the sight of the dying colony ship, Freedom's Dawn, drifting powerless against the starfield. But here's the thing about first impressions. Sometimes they lie to you. What Captain Mordoc initially mistook for a helpless civilian transport was actually something that made his engineering officers' jaw drop to the deck. The Freedom's Dawn wasn't just big, it was absolutely massive, stretching nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. Its hull bore the scars of what looked like 1,000 battles, with impact craters, burn marks, and patched sections that told the story of a vessel that had faced hell and refused to die. "By all the ancient spirits," Engineer Polvek whispered, his tentacles trembling as his scanners fed him impossible data. "Captain, their armor plating is 3 meters thick." 3 meters. It's not civilian construction. That's fortress-grade military shielding. This ship could ram through an asteroid, field, and ask for seconds. You know that moment when you realize you've completely misunderstood a situation? Like when you think you're helping a lost kitten, only to discover it's actually a tiger cub whose mother is lurking nearby? Captain Mordok was having one of those moments, magnified by about 1,000. The colony ship's hull wasn't just scarred, it was decorated with the kind of battle. It's damage that spoke of survival against impossible odds. Plasma burns from energy weapons, kinetic impact craters from railgun strikes, and what looked suspiciously like claw marks from something Captain Mordok didn't want to think about. This wasn't a transport that had gotten into trouble. This was a mobile fortress that had been fighting its way across the galaxy, and somehow it was still flying. "Establish emergency docking protocols," Captain Mordok ordered, his voice steady despite the growing realization that he was dealing with something far beyond his experience. "And someone figure out how to interface with their systems." "Hey." A feeling human engineering doesn't play by our rules. That turned out to be the understatement of the century. Human docking ports. It seemed were designed by people who believed that standard was a 4-letter word. Where Galactic Council ships used elegant magnetic coupling systems, the Freedom's Dawn employed what could only be described as mechanical bear traps that grabbed onto approaching vessels and held them with the grip of a drowning man. A life preserver. But when the airlock finally sealed and the view screen flickered to life, all of Captain Mordok's concerns about docking procedures vanished, because they're looking back at him with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes that held far too much courage for someone so young, was the child whose voice had haunted his dreams during the journey here. Lily Martinez looked exactly like what she was, an 8-year-old girl who had been thrust into a nightmare and refused to break. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes were singed and torn, and there was a smudge of what looked like engine grease across her left cheek.
Ow.
But her voice, when she spoke, was steady as bedrock. "Thank you for coming," she said, and the simple dignity in those words hit Captain Mordok like a physical blow. "We have wounded people, and the reactor's going critical. The medical bay is overwhelmed, and we're running out of time. Can you save us?" Captain Mordok felt something crack inside his chest, not his ribs, but something deeper, something that had been hardened by years of military service and political maneuvering, suddenly melted like ice in sunlight. "Hold on, little warrior," he heard himself say. "Help is coming." And that's when everything changed. Lieutenant Commander Valthera was coordinating the emergency supply transfer when her sensor array lit up like a fireworks display on New Year's Eve. Her blue-scaled hands flew over the controls, trying to make sense of readings that shouldn't have been possible. "Captain," she called out, her voice tight with something that might have been panic, "I'm detecting massive hyperspace distortions. Multiple signatures incoming. They're enormous." Captain Mordok turned toward the main viewport just as space itself seemed to lose its mind. You know that moment in horror movies when the music stops and everything goes quiet just before the monster appears? This was like that, except the monster was reality itself having a complete breakdown. Hyperspace rifts began tearing open around them like wounds in the fabric of existence. Not the clean, controlled emergence points that civilized ships used, but violent, chaotic tears that spoke of vessels pushing their engines far beyond safe parameters because safety was a luxury they couldn't afford. Through these screaming portals in space-time came ships that redefined Captain Mordok's understanding of the word warship. The first vessel to emerge was sleek and deadly, its hull black as the void between stars and bristling with weapon systems that made the Peacekeeper's defensive arrays look like children's toys. It was easily 3 times the size of his ship, and the energy signatures radiating from its weapon ports suggested it could crack a moon if the captain felt particularly annoyed. But that was just the beginning. More ships Followed destroyers with hulls that looked like they'd been forged from compressed nightmares, cruisers that moved through space like hunting sharks, and battleships that were less vessels and more mobile battle stations capable of sterilizing entire planets. Each one emerged from hyperspace with the kind of controlled violence that spoke of crews who had done this dance before and were very good at it. The smallest of these warships dwarfed the Peacekeeper, the largest, defied comprehension. It was less a ship and more a mobile fortress, bristling with enough firepower to reduce entire fleets to their component atoms. "Sweet, merciful void," Velthera whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own terror. "Captain, I count 47 vessels and more still coming. Some of these ships, their power signatures are off our scales. That big one could probably glass a continent with its main batteries." But then something wonderful happened that cut through. Captain Mordoc's growing terror like sunlight through storm clouds. On the view screen, Lily Martinez's face suddenly transformed. The careful composure, the brave mask she'd been wearing, the adult-like dignity, all of it melted away to reveal what she truly was, a little girl who had been scared out of her mind and was suddenly, finally, safe. "Uncle Marcus is here," she cried, her voice bright with joy and relief that made Captain Mordoc's heart skip a beat. "We're safe now. Everyone, Uncle Marcus came for us." And in that moment, Captain Mordoc understood with crystal clarity that everything he thought he knew about this situation had been completely, utterly wrong. This wasn't a rescue mission that had just gotten complicated. This was humanity unleashed. And the galaxy was about to remember why their wars always ended with enemy surrender. When General Marcus Thompson's voice cut across every communication frequency in the system, didn't just speak it, commanded reality itself to pay attention. The words that thundered from the speakers of every ship within 100 million kilometers carried the weight of absolute authority and barely contained volcanic fury. "This is General Marcus Thompson aboard the Colonial Defense Force vessel Unstoppable. Stand down all weapon systems immediately. My niece and 15,000 human civilians are aboard that vessel. I will personally burn this entire sector to radioactive ash before I allow harm to come to a single one of them." Captain Mordoc felt his blood turn to liquid nitrogen. As the implications of those words sank in, this wasn't just a rescue operation. This was a family member of one of humanity's top military commanders coming to collect his own. And judging by the name of his flagship, General Thompson wasn't particularly interested in negotiating. You know that feeling when you accidentally walk into the wrong neighborhood at 3 a.m. and suddenly realize that every shadow could be hiding something that wants to eat you? Captain Mordoc was having that exact experience, except the shadows were mile-long warships, bristling with enough firepower to crack planets. His scaled hands trembled as he opened emergency channels, trying to keep his voice steady and failing miserably. "General Thompson, this is Captain Mordoc of the Galactic Council vessel Peacekeeper. We're here on a humanitarian mission to assist your people. We mean no harm." The pause that followed lasted approximately forever. In the silence, Captain Mordoc could hear his own hearts beating, all three of them hammering against his ribs like prisoners trying to escape from a burning jail. Around him, his bridge crew held their breath, waiting for the response that would determine whether they lived to see another sunrise. When General Thompson finally spoke again, his voice had shifted from volcanic rage to something far more dangerous, controlled professional fury. "Acknowledged, Council vessel. Your assistance is noted and will be remembered. However, this is now a Terran military operational zone. Under my direct command, the word assistance carried enough weight to collapse a small moon. It wasn't gratitude, it was a statement of fact delivered by someone who clearly understood the difference between help offered freely and help that came with political strings attached. But what happened next was what truly separated the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Because while Captain Mordoc was busy trying not to wet himself, he was also witnessing something that military historians would study for the next 1,000 years: the deployment of a human rapid response fleet. Warships that had torn themselves out of hyperspace weren't just arriving haphazardly like some panicked mob. They were deploying with the kind of mechanical precision that spoke of countless hours of drill, countless simulations, and countless real battles where a single, Mistake meant the death of everyone you cared about. Medical frigates with red crosses, painted on their hulls, immediately locked onto the Freedom's Dawn and began extending docking tubes with the efficiency of surgeons opening a patient. These weren't just any medical ships, they were floating hospitals, equipped with surgical suites that could handle everything from laser burns to complete limb regeneration. Meanwhile, destroyers and cruisers spread out in defensive formations that would have made a chess grandmaster weep with envy. Each ship took up a position that maximized their field of fire while minimizing the chance of friendly fire incidents, creating overlapping kill zones that could turn any attacking force into component atoms in seconds. But the real showstopper was the massive battlecruiser Iron Vengeance. As it positioned itself at the very edge of the system like some ancient guardian deity, its weapon erased and Captain Mordok counted at least 40 main gun batteries began glowing with the kind of barely contained energy that made stars look like birthday candles. Captain Lieutenant Commander Valthera whispered, her voice tight with the kind of terror usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. I'm counting 67 human warships, with more hyperspace signatures still incoming. Some of these vessels, their power readings are beyond our comprehension. That battlecruiser alone could probably sterilize the surface of an entire planet, and she wasn't exaggerating. The Iron Vengeance was what humanity called a planet killer, not because it was designed to destroy worlds, but because it had the firepower to do so if the situation called for it. It was 2 miles long, packed with enough weapons to outfit a small fleet, and commanded by people who had learned their trade fighting wars, where overkill was considered a good starting point. But then something incredible happened that cut through all the fear and tension like a hot knife through butter. The main screen flickered. General Marcus Thompson's face appeared. Weathered human male with steel gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much war and not enough peace. Behind him, it's barely visible but unmistakable, was a small figure waving enthusiastically. Lily Martinez had found her way to her uncle's bridge, and she was beaming at Captain Mordok with the kind of pure joy that only children can manage. When the adults finally show up to fix everything, Captain Mordok, General Thompson said with formal military precision that somehow managed to convey both respect and barely leashed violence. The Colonial Defense Force formally acknowledges the Galactic Council's response to our civilian distress call. Your courage in entering restricted space to aid our people will not be forgotten. There was a brief pause as the general's expression shifted slightly, showing just a hint of what might have been paternal warmth. My niece tells. Miyu called her a little warrior. She's quite pleased with the title. But then the warmth vanished, replaced by something that made Captain Mordok's scales itch with primal fear. However, this situation is now under Terran military jurisdiction. We'll handle it from here, as Captain Mordok watched the human fleet work with terrifying efficiency. One thought kept circling through his mind like a vulture waiting for something to die. This massive response, 67 warships and counting, had arrived within minutes of the distress call. Minutes, which raised a question that he really didn't want to know the answer to. If this was just the ships that happened to be in the neighborhood, how many more were out there in the darkness, waiting? More importantly, what would happen to anyone foolish enough to threaten human civilians when the entire fleet decided to pay a visit? The galaxy was about to find out that humanity's withdrawal from galactic politics hadn't made them weaker. It had given them time to get stronger. As the rescue operations wound down and the Freedom's Dawn came back to life under the care of human engineering teams, Captain Mordok prepared for what he assumed would be a routine departure. His crew had done their duty, the crisis was over, and now it was time to return to Council space and file the kind of report that would probably get him either court-martialed or promoted, he wasn't sure which. But then General Marcus Thompson requested a private communication channel. Something in the man's tone made Captain Mordok's scales itch with nervous anticipation. When the general's face appeared on the screen, something had changed. The hard military mask had slipped away, replaced by something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't the voice of a commanding officer anymore. This was the voice of a grateful uncle who had just watched strangers risk everything to save his family. Captain Mordok, Thompson said quietly. his voice carrying undertones that made the reptilian officer's blood run cold. I want you to understand something crucial about what just happened here. Something that's going to change everything. Captain Mordock felt dread building in his chest like a slow-burning fire. General, I'm not sure I understand when that SOS went out, Thompson continued, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the camera with laser intensity. It wasn't just a distress call. It was a test. A test of the galaxy's character, of whether the civilized species had learned anything from the wars, of whether compassion could triumph over fear. You know that moment when you realize you've been playing checkers while everyone else was playing three-dimensional chess? Captain Mordock was having that exact revelation, except the stakes were measured in galactic politics and the potential for wars that could burn entire star systems. You came, Thompson said, and those two simple words carried more weight than a neutron star. Despite your fear of us, despite the quarantine that's kept our species apart for decades, despite every horror story whispered in council chambers about the savage Deathworlders, you came running to save a child you'd never met, because it was the right thing to do? The general gestured toward the viewports where the assembled human fleet stretched across space like a constellation of deadly stars. This response you're witnessing represents every available military asset within 100 light-years. Destroyers abandoned anti-piracy operations. Battlecruisers broke off from deep space reconnaissance. Hospital ships left their stations. Every ship, every crew, every weapon system dropped everything and came screaming through hyperspace because they heard that our children were in danger. Captain Mordock looked out at the fleet and felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. There were ships out there that he couldn't even classify, vessels that seemed to bend physics around them. Weapons platforms that radiated. Power signatures beyond anything in council databases. Medical ships that were bigger than most military bases. But here's what makes this moment special, Captain Thompson continued, his voice softer now, but somehow more intense. Every one of these ships came because they had to. Because protecting our civilians is what they're built for, what they're trained for, what they exist for. The general paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. But you, Captain Mordock, were already here when it mattered. You didn't come because of military orders or political obligations or family loyalty. You came because a child was crying for help, and that was enough. Have you ever had one of those moments when someone says something that completely reframes your understanding of reality? When suddenly you realize that what you thought was a simple situation was actually something much larger and more significant. Captain Mordock was having that experience, and it was both terrifying and oddly humbling. Through the viewport, he watched as the massive human dreadnought Earthshaker settled into formation with the rest of the fleet. It was a ship that could have served as a mobile capital for some smaller species, bristling with weapons that made planets negotiate rather than fight. But right now, it was just part of a family coming to collect their own. That's when General Thompson did something that changed the course of galactic history. He activated an open channel not just to the Peacekeeper, not just to the human fleet, but to every listening post, every communications relay, every intelligence gathering. Stationed within 50 light-years. His voice, when it came, carried the authority of someone who had just made a decision that would reshape the galaxy. "Attention, Galactic Council," he announced, his words cutting through subspace like a sword through silk. "By the authority vested in me as commanding officer of the Colonial Defense Force, and with the full backing of the Terran government, the quarantine on human space is hereby officially terminated." Captain Mordock felt his heart skip a beat. The quarantine had been in place for decades, a mutual agreement that had kept humanity isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Its termination would send shockwaves through every government, every military, every intelligence agency from the core worlds to the outer rim. Any species willing to risk themselves for human children? Thompson continued, his gaze fixed directly on Captain Mordock through the screen. Has earned humanity's friendship, our respect, and our protection. The galaxy has proven today that compassion can triumph over fear, that moral courage still exists among the stars. The general's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so fierce. "We're ready to talk." As the Peacekeeper prepared to jump to hyperspace, Captain Mordock realized that everything, absolutely everything, had just changed. The Deathworlders were no longer content to remain in the shadows of quarantine space. They were coming back to the galactic community, and they were coming back as friends to those who had proven themselves worthy of friendship. But what about those who hadn't? The last thing Captain Mordock saw before the hyperspace jump was little Lily Martinez on the bridge of the Unstoppable, waving goodbye with the innocent joy of a child who had no idea that her uncle had just rewritten the political map of the galaxy. It had all started with one little girl's courage, one desperate call for help, one moral choice to answer that call. Despite the fear, the galaxy would never be the same, and in the darkness between the stars, other powers were already beginning to calculate what humanity's return would mean for their own ambitions. The Deathworlders were back. The end.